Escadora's overflowing Cameo. Unique amulet. Okay, very interesting. Alright, some alright affixes, I suppose. Upon collecting a crackling energy, release a lightning nova, dealing lightning damage. Okay, I could kind of see why that would be good, though feels like it's missing something? Oh. Hello, my fellow sorcerers. Welcome one, welcome all, as we deep dive into the 8 Sorcerer Uniques and rank them from the worst to the best, along with lots of little interesting mechanics and secrets you might not know about them and how they function. What has potential, what doesn't, what needs some major changes, buffs, or just straight up deleting from our pool and replacing with something actually worth getting. Well, it's all going to be here because the road of Sorcerer Uniques is a roller coaster from utterly, garbage fire, you might as well sell it, to arguably the best single unique in the entire game. So, without further ado, let's get into this at 8th place. Flamescar. This one really makes me sad. It really does, because I really love Incinerate as a move. It's a very fun move to sit there channeling, blasting out fire as everything ideally melts before you. You can solve the mana issues of it quite easily. As you can see, I can channel this just forever, and if I was actually hitting things it would be even longer. Yeah, it's neat. Beams are good, and beams of fire are even gooder. The thing is though, Flamescar is last because simply Incinerate itself is so utterly awful, at least at the moment, which again, as I said, is a shame because, you know, the feel of the move is really, really fun and interesting, and I would love to make Incinerate work. I still don't believe it's impossible, but it just kind of is an antithesis to what you need to be doing in this game. You can't be spending time just stood still on the spot burning lines of enemies. The damage isn't good enough to justify that. You will die on our squishy broken armor resistance class because you're stood still getting hit by everything, and even if you want to be doing it and you say want to put on a cooldown, well, you have to stop and then restart burning. Essentially, Incinerate would have to do so much more damage while also making you take so much less damage before it's worth looking at. On top of that, if we look at things like the classic Firebolt enchant that causes direct damage from skills to cause burning, so then we can use our burning synergies, well, that doesn't actually apply to Incinerate because it's not direct damage, which means we can't even work in something like Frostbolt, so we can make an Incinerate that chills, which would actually be cool and have some implications. So, just to kind of prove it, as we Incinerate, you see they don't stay on fire because the Firebolt enchant is not actually affecting them. We blast them, and then they immediately go out, which means even as a tool for having enemies on fire, it's really, really bad. And yes, ultimately what they want you to be doing with Incinerate is in a fire build. They want you to have dropped a flame wall and set enemies on fire. They want you to have dropped a meteor and set enemies on fire. Then they want you to have hit enemies with a Hydra and set it on fire. Then once the enemy's burning from 3 different types of fire, then you just channel Incinerate on them until they die. In theory, that's lovely, but in practice, I don't need to explain to you why that's just not a way you can viably play the game. So when we actually... Oh, and don't even get me started on the lucky hit aspect of this, and it just doesn't happen. 23% sounds great. It's like, oh, every tick of Incinerate is going to trigger lucky hit, right? You will barely see lucky hit happen from holding down and channeling this, and a lot of things like, for example, the Frozen Orb enchantment, the 20% chance to launch a Frozen Orb when you cast the skill, of course with Incinerate, only starting to cast counts as casting. If every second you were channeling it and it was doing damage, you had a chance to send out a Frozen Orb, well then, again, yeah, we'd be talking. So with all of that in mind, the unique that buffs probably, and by probably I mean just the worst core skill, is obviously going to be the worst unique. And extra ranks, the lucky hit chance with fire, the extra damage to burning, the extra on physical damage, yeah, the actual affixes here are wonderful. And the unique effect itself that causes Incinerate to shut out these little orbs of fire is actually really good. These little orbs of fire can actually crit, unlike Incinerate, and they do decent damage if you build around that. A world in which you go all in on the little extra embers and watch them hit enemies and actually do something that isn't completely awful damage-wise is really, really cool. But it doesn't change the fact that standing there channeling Incinerate is probably the least effective way to play Sorcerer in the entire game. So sadly, until some major changes both numerically and mechanically happen here, well, our Flamescar is going to be bottom of the pile. Now, I promise the future Uniques won't have as much to say, it's just this one really does kind of get to me. In 7th place, then, it is Escadora's Overflowing Cameo. There's not much to say about this one. The affixes aren't bad. Crackling Energy can be very good damage, as we went over recently in the latest Arclash build. Non-physical damage is probably the single best stat you can get as Sorcerer, as it really amps you beyond what you would expect, as a recent discovery proved. Shocking Impact is fine, and movement speed is always nice, but yes, this means you're giving up things like mana cost reduction, you're giving up cooldown reduction, you're giving up the 1.5 times power legendary affix that you can put on your amulet. That is a huge loss in general and for this class, so it has to be worth it, right? So upon collecting a Crackling Energy, there is a chance to release a Lightning Nova. Now, the Lightning Nova itself is fine. It does decent damage, it's got a large range. If you play it in a build like my Ball Lightning one that summons so many Crackling Energies, that would be really neat. But 10% chance? What? I don't, if this didn't say that, if this was every Crackling Energy releases a Nova, this probably would still not be worth using, but at least it would be worth considering in a spam summon Crackling Energy build. But a 10% chance to tickle every enemy around you with kind of just average affixes? It boggles my mind. It really, really does. If this said Crackling Energy is now attracted towards you, and there's a 10% chance, so it kind of auto-collects it, so you can just summon so much of it with the right build and have it brought into you, then a 10% chance would make more sense, because that's a bonus for the utility of auto-collecting. But as it is, it's just kind of a joke, and it only gets to be 7th because, yeah, Incinerate really is just that bad. Moving on to 6th place then, we have, Gloves of the Illuminator. And this one really, really does make me sad. The affixes themselves, crit chance is great, attack speed is great, 3 ranks of Fireball is great, a lucky hit chance to stun is pretty decent, yeah, it's not perfect, but yeah, it's a solid bit of gear. Fireball now bounces as it travels, exploding each time. Oh, that's exciting. Fireball does a lot of damage, so bouncing, exploding, you can really rack some numbers up with this. But you have to deal at minimum 65% less damage for the privilege. No, no one wants a Fireball that's already too weak for Fireball as a core skill, doing 65% less damage. So to put that in perspective, Fireball, you throw it out, boom, it explodes, cool, that's all well and good, right? So with Gloves of the Illuminator on, to do the equivalent damage of just 1 Fireball, you have to hit the enemy with 3 of the bounces, which you could kind of see happen. You've stacked people up, you jump back, bounce, it almost kind of works out, you know. But in reality, no, it obviously doesn't. It's slow-moving, terrain clips and deletes the bouncing Fireball, and it just results in some really anticlimactic output for such a cool effect, because the bouncing exploding Fireball is awesome. Mechanically, it's fantastic. If this said, like, minus 20% damage at absolute most, we could probably have a really good Fireball build, but it's just so punishing to the point of you're actually nerfing a Fireball build by putting these gloves on. Again, it gets to be, you know, third least worst because the other two are just that bad, but it's really sad. Then we move on to 5th place, and it is the Staff of Endless Rage. This is exciting in principle. It's a staff, so it means we lose the wand and focus, which means we lose the inherent lucky hit, we lose the cooldown reduction, which is a huge blow. We lose the primary resource restore. We lose a lot of good affixes, so this effect has to be worth it. The extra damage to close, the extra core skill damage, yeah, that's nice. The chance to slow isn't actually the worst because you can stack some serious slow damage, and Inner Flames is just fine. But the actual unique effect needs to carry here, and it kind of does. Having a triple fireball go out is really, really potent. 3 of these things exploding at the same time at point blank against an enemy will obliterate them. Fireball as a skill is still a little bit too weak for how expensive it is, even when that got buffed, for how much damage it can actually do. It's just, really, there are better things to be spamming, but in principle, 3 of them, yeah, that's very nice. And obviously you can combine it with the previous entry to have triple bouncing fireball. Now, triple bouncing fireball, yeah, that's easier to hit enemies with multiple times, but as we discussed, it's still a nerf to your damage despite the bouncing. But as you can see, spamming it out here, like in how it plays, the fun, it's very good, and if the numbers weren't so prohibitively low and awful, this would be such a good build, and I have really tried to make it work. I really have. But the bottom line is, the damage output just isn't there, and it just doesn't flow as well as the actual good builds. So while there is potential here, and all it would take is Fireball getting a big enough damage buff to make Staff of Endless Rage worth it, it's currently not. Then, in 4th place, we have Staff of Lam Esen. This is okay, right? This is our first unique that's actually okay and actually viably works in a build. You can play charge bolts with Staff of Lam Esen. The piercing is nice, especially when you combine it with the static cling aspect that makes them track and go through enemies multiple times, and you can get away with it. The 25% less damage is the kind of cost that should be on the fireball one, and that still makes it kinda usable. But the affixes don't make up for the loss of wand and focus. They don't make up for the loss of the attack speed, they don't make up for the loss of the cooldown reduction, and the 2 legendary aspects you can no longer have to gain charged bolts piercing. Essentially, this would need to buff the damage of Charged Bolts to be worth using, not nerf it for the privilege. If this was Charged Bolts Pierce and deal 25 to 35% more damage, then we would use this and have a really cool Charged Bolts build. But as it stands, the best Charged Bolts build doesn't use the Charged Bolts Unique, and you know that's an issue. So while you can, and it works, so it's not as bad as the others, it's still a real letdown, sadly. Then, in 3rd place, we actually get to, yeah, alright, not bad, Infinite Iceheart Brais. This is pretty decent, and effective in the right setup, like my Ice Shards at range Chain Freeze Explosion build. Losing the defensive affixes on legs is bad, losing the defensive aspect on legs is bad, but the freeze duration is great, the damage to frozen and injured is great, the int is always nice, but the extra chance for frozen enemies to do an extra Frost Nova as our best source of CC in Vulnerable, you really feel that if you are chain freezing. So bottom line, Iceheart Brais is really niche, but in the builds where it works, of which there is only a couple, it does work really well, especially combined with the Frost Blitz to have 2 charges of Frost Nova. So it takes a comfortable 3rd. Now we get to the first unique, which can be described as good. Now we get to the first unique which can be described as good, and that is Esus Heirloom. This is just a huge bump to your crit chance, and it's a boot slot, which means it's a nice, decent way to get damage out of your boots, which normally you can't. Movement speed is always good, and the actual sprint after the dash is really good too, which obviously translates to even more crit chance when it happens. And you kind of feel that as you go. I have a 52% chance to crit when I have dodged. That is hefty, it really is. You do lose the ability to have ranks of teleport, frost nova, and mana cost reduction, which are really potent and good affixes on your boots, but the damage gain is certainly worth it in a build that cares about the movement speed and the crit, and Esus heirlooms are always worth considering when you're building Sorcerer. A lot of the time, the affixes I just mentioned do eke out, but there is certainly merit to have here in certain setups, and you do feel good equipping these. So yeah, I quite like them. They're a bit boring in terms of how they actually play. You don't see anything, there's no fancy effect for a unique. You could totally see that the crit chance increase by movement speed be a normal Sorcerer legendary affix, but hey, we have them and they're, you know, good. Then we get to what you of course knew was going to be number one, which is Raiment of the Infinite. If you've not got one yet, I really hope it drops for you soon. This unique, I don't need to go into detail. We all know how insanely good teleporting on a group of enemies, stunning them all, grouping them all is for every class and build in the game. There is no one that doesn't like this situation happening, and given how often you can actually cast teleport, it's just really, really good, and I, for one, am so happy we have it, because without this, our unique selection would be so sad and anticlimactic. Glass Cannon is good, the damage to stun and close is good, and the int is good. It's damage from a slot that usually doesn't, and yes, while this makes us much squishier, it's always worth having it, and is universally good in every single Sorcerer build, because this effect is never not useful. It's so potent, and I definitely think Raiment of the Infinite would be in the conversation for best unique in the game across all classes, if we ignore the 6 ridiculous overpowered ultra rare ones like Shaco. So this is awesome, and you know that it's awesome, and it's by far the one I need to spend the least time talking about. So that all said then, that is the unique ranking from worst to best as it currently stands. I'm very much hoping for changes to the weaker ones, buffs, a few little mechanical tweaks as we go into the seasons, and hopefully they become much more, the only real word for it is usable. There's some really interesting cool effects here, there really is. All of the move affecting ones, Fireball, Charged Bolts, and Incinerate are really fun in their design, but how they actually have come to be is just too weak to be worth using, and it should never, ever be bad to equip the unique that affects the move that your build is built around. And when it comes to Fireball and Charged Bolts, that's the case, and that is just simply unacceptable in their design. So, that's kind of that, and another quick little note to Escadoras, please just let it attract crackling energy to you. That would be so cool, so worth considering. I would love that in a Sorcerer Unique. But now then, let me know what you think of them all, let me know how you're getting on with them, which ones you have, which ones you don't, which ones you want. I still want to try and make a Fireball build work. I still want to try and make an Incinerate build work, and I still have a build idea that actually does use Escadoras, so stay tuned, we'll see how those develop. I might get them to the point that are worth showing you, as I am stubborn that way. But for now, like if you enjoyed this, subscribe and hit the bell for more, consider supporting the future of the channel on Patreon down below, and until we meet again, a goodbye.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.